Hi everyone, welcome back. This is Cilla's Corner. I'm Cilla and I'm so happy to see you all here today. As you know, it's Thursday. That means it's Cilla's Reading Corner today. And we have one that I am super passionate about. If you follow me for any amount of time, I'm a huge Harry Potter fan. So we are doing this special edition, fully illustrated Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling, of course. This is, for some reason, if you have never heard of the Harry Potter series, definitely go check them out. This is a wizarding community type of book series. It is absolutely the greatest, and I promise if you're into any form of magical and mystical and anything like that, you will be hooked on this like so many millions have. But why don't we jump into it? As you can see, this is the fully illustrated version. My husband surprised me with this for our anniversary this year, and I was ecstatic. We had been hunting for it ever since I found out that it existed. This is the hardcover, which I believe they only came out in hardcover, but isn't it absolutely gorgeous? And the entire book is like that now. I'm just going to shift here so I can make sure. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. I don't know how to pronounce the names, and I do not want to butcher it, so this is designed and illustrated by, and it says right there, your content, and then, this is probably going to be a short, sort of longer reading, only because I want to make sure I give plenty of credit back to this drawer and artist, because oh my god, this is absolutely amazing. For a person that is obsessed with Harry Potter and heavily into it, this is just like the diamond in the rough. I love this. Chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived. Before I even fully begin, I should say I don't know how much I'll be reading. We'll just kind of go along with the time stamp and we'll go from there. Mr. and Mrs. Dudley of number 4 Private Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dudley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dudley was thin and blonde, and very nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful, as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think that they could bear it if anyone found out that the Potters, Mrs. Potter, and Mrs. Dursley's sister. But they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband was as un-Dudleyish as it was possible. What the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never seen him. The boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixed with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dudley woke up to the dull gray Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dudley hummed as he picked out the most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dudley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large, tawny owl fluttered past the window. As 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dudley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. "Little tyke," choked Mr. Dudley. As he left the house, he got into his car and backed out of number 4 drive. It was It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dudley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Private Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dudley blinked and stared at the cat. It started back as Mr. Dudley drove around the corner and up the road. He watched the cat in his mirror. And there's the illustration for this one. It was now reading the sign that said Private Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dudley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the unusual morning traffic, he couldn't help notice that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dudley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some new stupid fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdies. Standing quite close by, they were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dudley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dudley as that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved, and only a few minutes later, Mr. Dudley arrived at Grunning's parking lot, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dudley also sat with his back to the window in the office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls scooping past in broad daylight. Though people down the street did, they pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl, even at nighttime. Mr. Dudley, however, had a perfectly normal, arrow-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people, made several important phone calls, and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he stretched his legs and walked across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the bakery. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This bunch, whispering excitedly, too, and he couldn't see a single collection tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large donut in a bag, that he caught a few words they were saying. The Potters, that's right. That's what I heard. Yes, their son, Harry. Mr. Dudley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whisperers as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to the office, snapped at his security not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking. No, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there was lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He never seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dudley. She always got so upset at the mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he had a sister like that, but all the same, those people in cloaks, he found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon. And when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried he walked straight into someone just outside the door. Sorry, he grunted, as a tiny old man stumbled and almost fell It was a few seconds before Mr. Dudley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I forgot to turn that off. Ah, there we go. Sorry about that. Let me just try to get it on vibrate. I'm gonna have to put you on hold for just a second. My bad. Hi, we're back. So sorry about that. Now, right back where I think we were, Mr. Dudley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passerbyers stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating the happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dudley around the middle and walked off. No real big design on that one. Okay. Mr. Dudley stood rooted on to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was that tabby cat he spotted that morning. It was now sitting in his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dudley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dudley wondered, trying to pull himself together to let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dudley had had a nice normal day. She told him over dinner about all of Mrs. Next Door's problems with her daughter and how Dudley had learned a new word, won't. Mr. Dudley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report of the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that their national owls have been behaving very unusual today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there has been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping patterns. The newscaster allowed himself a grin, most mysterious. "And now, over to you, Jim McGriffin. With the weather, going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim?" "Well, Ted," said the weatherman, "I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dudley have been phoning in to tell me that instead of the rain I promised yesterday, there have been a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week's, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight." Mr. Dudley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain, owls flying by daylight, mysterious people in cloaks, and all over the place. And a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dudley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He had to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. "Prudence, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you?" As he had expected, Mrs. Dudley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. "No," she said sharply. "Why?" "Funny stuff on the news," Mr. Dudley mumbled. "Owls shooting stars, and there's a lot of funny-looking people in town today." "So?" snapped Mrs. Dudley. "Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her crowd." And then there's a really cute little drawing there. Mrs. Dudley sipped her tea through her pursed lips. Mr. Dudley wondered whether he dared tell her he heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said as casually as he could, "Their son. He'll be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? I suppose so, said Mrs. Dudley stiffly. What his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. Nasty common name if you ask me. Oh, yes, said Mr. Dudley. His heart sank horribly. Yes, I quite agree. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dudley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dudley crept to the bedroom window and peered down the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Private Drive as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to the pair of... Well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dudsleys got into bed. Mrs. Dudley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dudley laid awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near the Mrs. Dudley. The Potters knew very well that he and Prunette thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Prunette could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dudley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but that cat on the wall outside was showing no signs of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Private Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when the car door slammed on the next street, nor when 2 hours scooting overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before that cat moved at all. Now look at that photo. Isn't that absolutely gorgeous? Oh, wow. A man appeared on the corner the cat had been watching, appeared so suddenly and slightly you would have thought he just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and his eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen on Private Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver in his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak that swept the ground, and the high-heeled buckle boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broke at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. And I think right there is where I'll leave it for today, and we will continue again next week. I don't want this video to run too low. If you guys would rather me just continue for quite a while, please let me know underneath this video and I'll gladly continue. I hope you guys like the first installment of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone illustrated version. I know I love this story, and I hope you really enjoyed this. I'll see you again next week at Cilla's Reading Corner. Bye, you guys. Love you. Mwah.